That was a generic intro, I suppose, so maybe I should add to that. I did work for 3 or 4 years in the Primary Care Clinical Trials Network, and I'm really glad I did for today's presentation. So I think otherwise, after this morning's presentations, I probably would have left the room. It's just such a different environment. But yeah, so I'm bringing that kind of knowledge to this as well. So thank you very much to Declan and Tom and the TMRN for having PPI on the agenda here, and for inviting me to speak. And I think particularly for facilitating me to come to the earlier sessions. I was saying to some people over coffee, the whole clinical trial space is such a regulated space, like deep breath when Fionnuala starts about project management. The space I live in where we're talking PPI every day, is very different. And I think the challenge now is to bring the PPI thinking and ethos into the clinical trial space. And maybe the people in the room who will relate most to what we're doing are maybe the people in the non-CTEMP space, so maybe the OTs in the room, people who are involved in feasibility trials or in trials led by academic investigators that are getting started. But I think it's really important that we don't stop there, and it's very important that we do look at how we can bring the patient voice into the regulated clinical trial space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is PPI. So I think one of the things about this is, again, even talking to people at something like this, everyone says, oh yeah, I know what it is. So we'll just try and, get a few basic tenets to make sure we all have the same understanding. Why you would involve public or patients in planning and conducting clinical trials. I'll give a few examples of where it has been done, and then a little bit about maybe how you might go about it. So the very basic, simplest definition of public and patient involvement is this well-used one from the Involving UK. Research being carried out with and by members of the public rather than to, for or about them. So the idea coming from the disability movement, nothing about us without us. If you're going to do trials involving patients, we'd like a say in how you do them, what you measure and how the whole process operates. I've worked with many different PPI groups, and this definition in particular I like from a member of one of those groups, that people who are likely to be using new treatments are directly involved in and shape the decisions made to produce the treatments. Now this definition is particularly relevant for this audience where we're developing drugs, testing drugs, new treatments, and the people that are going to be impacted want to be involved in the decision making. This one kind of scared me. Last summer I was in a meeting with some PPI contributors, and one person who's an adult, a full-time carer of an adult son with severe disability, and this person herself has acquired a physical disability, and she just sat there and she said, well, this research, the research you're doing is impacting my future. I want to be able to shape it. And it's when you hear the voice of somebody directly going to be impacted by the research you're doing, it really makes you realise how important it is to take their view into consideration as you plan and begin to do your work. So we describe PPI as being a spectrum of involvement. There are many different approaches, and it's about choosing the most appropriate approach for your work where you are. And maybe it's a classic case of don't let perfection get in the way of the good, and particularly for people who haven't embarked on this before. At the very bottom of the pyramid here, we have no involvement. Involvement isn't about giving information. Information evenings aren't PPI. That's where researchers and clinicians tell the patients about what they're doing. And yeah, there might be a bit of Q&A, but that's not involvement. But as we move up that triangle, we do get to moving into kind of consulting with your relevant population, involving them in decision making, and ultimately working in partnership. So what does that actually mean? I think one of the things about this is so as many of you'll know, okay, backtrack, I should have said, PPI Ignite Network, mentioned in the introduction, is a network around Ireland funded by the Health Research Board and the Irish Research Council. There's 7 lead universities, 10 national partners and over 50 local partners. I'll talk about them again. Am I too close?
Yeah, probably.
Okay, that a bit better. Yeah, I could kind of hear it myself.
Yeah.
Okay, so the HRB in particular have been really strong in driving public and patient involvement in Ireland since about 2014, 2015. And I think one of the questions we have to ask is, like, when we started on this whole journey of trying to maybe change the research culture in Ireland, did we know all the questions? We didn't. We didn't know all the answers. We didn't even know the questions. And in ways, this is a really good way to approach building PPI in your work. Involving your patient, your public, it's about asking the different perspective to find out what you don't know. Already in the room, we've seen such people who are experts in what they do, and Alistair earlier and the other speakers. You know what you know. So what PPI is about is that elements of your area that you don't know. And starting out, you actually don't know what those bits are. So it's about bringing to light new considerations, looking at things through a different perspective. So PPI is about listening to the patient, asking them what matters. How should we run the study so it'll work for people like you? What matters to us? And that leads you into the space of outcomes. What outcomes should we be looking at? And I think one of the things, and again, inclusion and having breadth in your trial population has been mentioned, but like including who and what are the important voices to include. You can't, at the start, you can't have input from everybody you're trying to include. So the question you're asking, well, in my trial, which of these people is important? Which of these people don't I know their perspective? So you're trying to identify the diversity that you want to involve in your trial so that you get that voice to help you with your planning. So we think about PPI as being an active, equal partnership between the patient, the carer, and the researchers and the clinicians at all stages of the research and development process. So it's not only about when we're developing our patient information leaflet, it's much, much broader. And I bring you back to our London Underground picture that Rabia used earlier on. All the decisions are made by the time the first patient is recruited. And by the time you're submitting your ethics, probably 80% of them are made. So if you don't get your patient voice included right from the start, there's very little decision making to be made, and you're really doing lip service. So it's really about thinking how soon, how early, before you even begin to think about the details of your study, we should be trying to build those partnerships, and they don't happen overnight. And I really emphasise part of the decision making. So where are the decisions made in trials? We'd mentioned about steering groups already. So involving some patient voice on your steering group is important. But again, think of the whole dynamic around a steering group. You can't just, click your fingers and bring a patient advocate or a patient person into that environment and expect them to be able to follow everything that's going on. So it does take time to build capacity. I think it's important in PPI, we say to people we're trying to involve, you don't need to know about research. You're grand, we want your lived experience. And then the first thing we do is we give them 20 documents, like the clinical trial regulations and the protocol and, maybe a manual about GCP or something. So that's obviously not what we want to do. What we want to do is change our language and how we communicate, and maybe communicate in, side rooms or side conversations in advance of our big conversations. We don't want to make amateur researchers out of our PPI contributors. We want them to remain outside of the research environment in how they think and how they talk. So why do we do it? There's a lot of research done elsewhere on the why, and we see it day to day in terms of the work we're doing. It's very much considered best practice, that it enhances the quality, the relevance, and the acceptability of research. So in terms of the relevance of the research questions, what is important to the community you're focusing on? The inclusion of outcomes that matter, I've mentioned that already. That's not to say that clinical outcomes aren't important. That's not to say things that have come through from the research aren't important, but it is important to know what outcomes matter to the people living in the environment or with the condition you're talking about. It can very much impact the acceptability and the feasibility of the whole way you do your study. I have a good example of that coming up. And if the protocol is designed to suit the type of people you're trying to recruit, well then that's going to increase your recruitment and retention, and that is really important. Much of our research is publicly funded, and when it's publicly funded, the public have a right for accountability and safeguarding, and they have a right to be involved in shaping the research and in knowing what's happening in the whole research world. There's a lot of talk about research waste. No expert on clinical trials, but I've heard so much about under-recruiting trials that don't reach their power numbers and so on. Again, the better your protocol is, the better your retention and your recruitment is, reducing waste. And increasingly funders demand it. It has been like this in the UK in particular for many years. Now it is becoming a given with some of the Irish funders, and it's going broader. There's good and bad in that. It has definitely raised the profile. But the danger of PPI, the danger is obviously that it will become tokenistic. So PPI can also help basic issues about the study protocol. You know, you're wanting to recruit and you're bringing people into Vincent's or the hospital in Galway and there's no parking. You know, so it's the basic things that sometimes are so obvious. But again, if we think back to the presentations this morning, there were all kinds of people around the table, but there wasn't a patient around the table. The only reference to a patient was maybe the word subject. So it is about, sometimes we're all so siloed into what we're thinking about, our regulation, our ethics, you know, whatever it is. But it is important that you're thinking about the people you're going to be trying to recruit. And sometimes it's the most basic things that we miss. It's thinking about identifying the needs of the specific population. So we had the questions earlier about language and trying to recruit people with language barriers. I mean, in the whole COVID situation, more maybe in the UK because of the population numbers, but there were particular communities more adversely affected by COVID. So therefore you would really need to be thinking about, well, how can we make sure we get those people into the trial? And for those, that will give you a focus on maybe putting more effort into multilingual both recruitment and materials and so on. So you're trying to think about what is the little niches that are different. It can help address issues that arise during the trial, particularly if things like adverse events happen and there's maybe amendments to your information leaflet have to go back out to the people who are already in part, that sort of thing. But as I said, there's a lot of the decisions are already made by the time the trial gets going. It can be very good in terms of developing peer study team members, and there's really good examples where, say for example, people who have already experienced breast cancer then become trained up to do the recruitment of people immediately on diagnosis. So in situations where you're trying to recruit within 24 or 48 hours of somebody receiving a diagnosis, the empathy and the knowledge of having been through an experience is really powerful, and there's really good data showing how that particular situation of having people with lived experience helping you actually do the research can reap benefits. And it can inform post-marketing efforts, and it is also a really strong voice. If you have brought your patient partners with you through your trial, it's a strong voice in securing additional funding, or if you have a longer one, even your initial funding. And it is increasingly being a strong voice in the regulatory process, and we've all seen that, when there's HPRA are looking at, or HICWA are looking at, payment for drugs and things like that. The patient partner voice is important. Interesting paper from 2017 where they looked at everything costs money. Now, in ways the money for PPI is tiny compared to some of the other costs in a trial, but people will ask, well, what's the return on it? So an interesting paper they did modelled the cost, and they were saying, well, what if, with modelling we make a few assumptions, what if having involvement early on prevents one less protocol amendment throughout the cycle? And let's assume it impacts maybe in a 5 or 10% low level impact, but some impact on recruitment, adherence and retention. What's the return on your investment? So they're saying that by doing that, there can be significant benefit for a trial. And probably the best way, the last second two bullets here, that if you invest $100,000, I would love to be on a trial where somebody was investing $100,000 on PPI. But if you did, that you could have a 5-fold return on your investment. And in terms of a pre-phase 2 product, so that's very early on, you could get that product to market 2.5 years quicker. So it gives you some sense of small investment in PPI can have a positive benefit. So what is PPI not about? It is not about participation. It's not about the patients you recruit into your trial. It's not about doing market research, which can sometimes be misinterpreted, nor is it about qualitative data collection. Alistair mentioned earlier they had done a survey of 600 or 800 people about consent in trials, and that is really good data and it's really good research. But that's research. So where you might see PPI in influencing qualitative data would be around the language of your surveys, or in fact, how would you make sure that you get breadth in the people who are responding to your survey? So there's many other things that PPI isn't. So it really is all about drawing on the lived experience, the people who have walked the walk, to bring you their experience and listening to some of what they say to influence your trials. So where does it fit in? PPI can operate right across all the different phases of the trials. I won't focus much on preclinical because it is different with lab-based, but for anywhere where you're involving the recruiting human people, you've great scope. And really it's about learning from the experiential knowledge, we've mentioned that. So here's one example, and again this is around a feasibility study where publicly funded, HRB funded, and it was in the area of MS. And this man, Robert, lives with MS. Now, in this case, again, it was, the question was being asked, well, how can I best bring the lived experience to the table? And it was a classic case of, I don't actually know the impact that this will have, because this started maybe at the early days of PPI growth in Ireland. And the PI decided that they would hire somebody living with MS, 20% FTE, a day a week, as part of the trial team. Let's see where it goes was kind of very much the thinking on it. And it just took off. Now, Robert lives with severe MS and worked as part of the team. And some examples of how he impacted what was going on. So the feasibility trial was using materials that had been developed elsewhere and seeing how would it roll out in Ireland. And it came with a beautiful manual, very well laid out, and the idea was an intervention over 10 weeks. The person with MS was going to get a copy of this beautiful manual, they'd have it beside them and they'd work through the intervention. Now it is a beautiful manual, it's got a lovely paper. One of the things that MS does, it can really interfere with your touch, with your sensation at the top of your fingers. When Robert picked this up, he wasn't able to turn the pages. Just couldn't use it. And also it was perfect bound, so it didn't stay flat. So putting it beside you, not able to turn the pages and not able to keep it down while you're following intervention, somebody with MS just wouldn't even start. Or if they had been recruited thinking this is great, obviously retention would be a huge issue. So the solution was to produce ordinary paper, whatever we put into our photocopier, with wire bound. And it was possible to turn the pages and put it down beside you. So that's what I mean by sometimes, because we didn't know about the problem with your fingertips. The things we don't know, we don't know. Robert contributed in many other ways. It was being recruited around Ireland. Recruitment was better in some places than other places. And he went on local radio and had a big impact in local areas in terms of recruitment. What does a radio love but a story? So Robert told his story of his diagnosis, and maybe in a 20-minute interview, there was 3 minutes about the trial. And that was enough to get interest. During COVID, it moved pre-COVID into actually being conducted during COVID, helped with telephone recruitment, where again, somebody ringing up, I've got MS, would you like to get part of this trial? Big retention. Trained up and did some qualitative interviews on the feasibility of the trial. How did this work for you? And importantly, the intervention was being delivered by healthcare professionals. And again, the man living with MS trained the healthcare professionals. Now, this is an example of maybe really good, in-depth PPI, so don't let perfection get in the way of the good. Another really good example from the UK, where, and this is probably very relevant in this space, a group of people got together, people living with motor neuron disease, a neurologist, a problem with the fact that the collar given out by the NHS didn't meet their needs. It was great if you had whiplash, but if you were living with motor neuron disease and you wanted mobility, it didn't work. So this went through a huge cycle over about 6 or 8 years, where initially we had a group of people coming together with lived experience. Then a charity got involved. They raised some funds, got a university involved, and the university the researchers happened, and they produced an alternative collar, which basically was like a snood. It went to manufacture. Initially it was only available privately, and then the NHS got involved, and it's now part of the NHS, available to everybody. So it doesn't happen overnight, but the patient partners right from the start influenced every phase of the cycle, so really good understanding. You can have PPI in undertaking and managing your studies in many different ways. This is a really good example. Again, this is a trial, non-clinical. It's about trying to develop a new type of service for young people with diabetes. This young adult panel, 18 to 25-year-olds, built up over 5 or 6 years. It's still going strong. They've gone through a feasibility study, a pilot study, and now they're hoping to go on to a full trial. And the guy on the left is Sean Deneen. He's the director of the, is it your left? Yes, of the PPI network. And this is a really good example of building up expertise over the years that's influencing something that's going to go into practice. And another example from the UK, with a clinical trial facility where they were running a trial of to do with common cold, and every now and then we'll go back and check, especially around adverse events, their PPI group. In PPI, don't talk about dissemination, talk about sharing the results. Patient voice, very powerful. In terms of the how-to, it's important to upskill, to understand PPI, understand the essence, the idea of shared decision making, of building capacity, of talking a different language. So our network has a website, we have a lot of resources on it. There's a calendar of events, lots of PPI training happening. There's a really good digital badge available from UCC. Even if you don't complete the badge, some of the videos are really good in terms of introducing you to PPI. And there's also, in some of the universities, masters, 5 ECTS modules on it. So my final slide would be to say that in every part of the trial, looking at yesterday's programme and today's programme, there's room for patient input. And I suppose that's what we would be hoping to. So lots more I could have talked about, but we've run out of time. So thank you very much.